Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Lecture 7 of English 1120, Time and History in Literature. Tonight, we're going to go over some tips for writing your research essay that's due in a few weeks, March 26th. So without further ado, let's get right into it. And we're going to start by looking at the syllabus. So the syllabus describes the what you're expected to do for the third assignment. So it's due March 26th. The length around 1,200 words, so plus or minus 100 words. That should be around 4 to 5 pages. If you use kind of standard font and spacing. And this is a research essay. So I'm going to talk about what's expected there. But basically, you're expected to have engaged with 3 secondary sources. So engage with their arguments, reference them in some way as either supporting or reacting against their interpretation of the work. So to back up for a second, your research essay will be on Milton's Paradise Lost, which we're going to start reading next week. So we'll be reading that for the next 2 weeks. So your essay will be to articulate a certain interpretation of that, to do the research on that, and then encounter those maybe differing interpretations or interpretations that that support your view. In terms of logistics, of course, post the essay as a Word or PDF document on the assignment section of the course Brightspace page. I'm going to go over these essay writing tips, but I reference the essay writing tips here. There are the elements of an excellent academic essay. On the essay writing tips page also, I won't go over this, but there's also, on the tips page, there's a discussion of what I would recommend as some process tips, you know, in terms of how to overcome writer's block and that type of thing. There's also some old sample essays from students from previous courses. Okay, so they not all of them were necessarily A+, but they're all very good essays that you can kind of get inspired by. The style guide, that is a Department of English style guide. So if you want to go in and look at tips for how to cite the articles, it's all broken down there. It's using the Modern Language Association citation method. I'm not going to be a real stickler for which method you use, but so if you wanted to use the APA or a different style, that's fine, as long as it's clear and consistent. But if you're without a style, so to speak, the MLA style is outlined quite well there. Values 30%. Okay. As always, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. So I'm going to go over the essay topics now. So these are fairly general topics, but if you don't feel you've got something there, you can tweak those slightly, or email me if you want to articulate your thesis slightly differently. But the key is to make sure it's clear, it's specific enough, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the elements of a good thesis, so that you don't get hung up on that. So the topics that I've recommended here, a lot of them center around the question, and if as you get reading it, you'll understand this more, but the question of Satan and Satan's role in Milton's Paradise Lost. So Milton's Paradise Lost is about the Christian myth of the fall of Adam and Eve, and that's depicted in Genesis. And there, at least in Paradise Lost, an agent of that fall, one who seems to aid in that fall, is Satan in the form of the serpent. And we get to see Satan in hell rousing his troops. He's a very heroic figure in some senses. And how does that jive with Milton's, at least on the surface level, his orthodox religious intention of trying to, let's say, inculcate a spiritual perspective in his readers. So what is the role of Milton's Satan there? Is he, how is Satan a hero? Is he a hero? Are we meant to see Satan in any way as heroic? So that's been a kind of a huge debate in the literature and interpretation of Milton's Paradise Lost since it was written. So William Blake is a famous romantic poet writing these lines in around the 1790s. So over 100 years after Milton, and he wrote that the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when he wrote of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. So Blake was saying that Milton was presented Satan and hell and those episodes so forcefully, and when he tried to depict God, it was so banal because he was of the devil's party unconsciously, so to speak. So do we agree with Satan? Is Satan the true hero of Milton's epic? Why or why not? So a simple question there. That should be broad enough. You don't have to go into the Blake part. That's just kind of flourish at the beginning. You don't have to know Blake. What you're studying is Milton there. So is Satan the true hero of Milton's epic? Why or why not? And then 2, how does Milton redefine the figure of the epic hero in Paradise Lost? Through his depiction of one of Adam, Eve, Christ, or Abdiel. So there it's less about Satan, but other heroes, possible heroes that have often been put forth in the tradition of criticism. And in what way is the notion of heroism, let's say, redefined by, if we were to take one of those figures as the hero? Then 3, describe how jealousy, linked ultimately to pride, leads to the fall of Adam and Eve in Book 9 of Paradise Lost. Topic 4, why is Satan affected so much when he sees Adam and Eve in Book 4? Why does he decide to continue his mission? So there's a famous scene there when he first enters paradise. He kind of recoils back and kind of he's reminded of the bliss he's lost, and he sees that Adam and Eve are enjoying this sort of bliss, and whereas he's basically hell, he himself is hell. In the proem of his epic, Milton calls on the aid of the heavenly muse to aid his adventurous song that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian mount while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. What is the meaning of this aspect of his invocation? In what ways, through his depiction of the cosmos and its universal history, does Milton pursue things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme? So here, the topic is talking about the invocation. And remember, we talked both when we looked quickly at Homer and then when we looked at Virgil, that epic convention of invoking a muse to inspire the poet to be able to describe aspects of, let's say, the future, the past, things in the heavens, things that took place among the gods that humans don't otherwise have access to. So too here in Milton, there is this. There are a number of invocations of a Christian muse to inspire his song. So that's the topics, the expectations of the essay. And now I'd like to, can everyone see this document? Now I've switched to a document called Research, Think, Write. Does everyone see that?
Yes.
Thank you. So basically, this is just a summary, I would say, of the sorts of skills, three three basic sets of skills you're going to need to take away from undergrad generally, and that employers are looking for increasingly. I would say there's an increasing let's say element of research being done in any kind of walk of white collar employment these days, just with the nature of the amount of reports and data that need to be synthesized. Research skills, critical thinking skills, and writing skills are according to surveys of employers and business councils, are highly sought after skills, no matter what the technical background of the employee. So too in this course, when we look at the research essay, you think of it as one way to sharpen those tools in your toolbox in terms of those skill sets. Okay, so you're going to have to undertake research. You're going to have to take all the information you got from that research and analyze it and critically assess it. Then you're going to have to be able to persuasively convince others of a particular interpretation of that set of evidence and set of data. Okay, so this could be in this course, this could be in any, whether it's the sciences, whether it's social sciences, whether it's history, what have you, other courses as well. Those basic skill sets are going to serve you well. And then, as I said, in employment, I know in my own day job working for the federal government, people who are good in those three skill sets are highly sought after and have profitable careers. Okay, so let's start with research. So this just come for some basic, let's say, points of departure for thinking about how to undertake the research when it comes to this class. Okay, the general principles hold for other courses, but this is the specifics are tailored for this class. So so I kind of like to think of research. So why do we do it? So I would say, since the beginning of kind of modern, well, broadly modern, last 70,000 years, since we started to try to symbolically represent things through language, humans said, okay, well, let's try to understand the world more. And basically we've had to say, okay, well, the world and the cosmos are a big place, and no one can understand the whole. So why don't we break it up into parts? And why don't you guys go study the trees and the stones over there? Why don't you study some stars? We'll study we'll study governments and try to figure out what governments do. And in the original classic tradition, the idea was that they'd come back and there'd be kind of an overarching science called philosophy that would bring together these, let's call them disciplines. So research is let's say exploration and searching after those kind of particular domains that have been carved up. So we are going to have a particular domain for our research in an English class, and that's English literature. For your own paper, you've narrowed that down to the work, and then to Paradise Lost, and you're going to have to even be more narrow, and try to hone in on maybe a particular set of passages, a particular question, to make the research meaningful, so that it's not too broad and not too vague. So research and analysis involves gathering the appropriate sources of evidence, and humanities courses, we rely on textual evidence. Okay, so in most humanities courses, we can distinguish between primary texts and secondary texts. So the primary text, whether it's literary, historical, artistic, philosophical, are the texts under investigation. So we want to get a better understanding of that primary text. Okay, so it's primary texts are, let's say, the speeches, the words, or the written artifacts of humans. So we're in the humanities, we're studying humans, and so these are the effects that we have of them, their thoughts, their behaviors that as represented in those texts. And then the secondary texts are interpretations of the primary text undertaken by other scholars or other writers throughout the tradition. For instance, a primary text for your assignment in a history class might be a particular social reform movement, and then more particularly, the primary text might be documents, so in an archive around the movement. In a visual arts class, the primary text may be a painting by Van Gogh, philosophy class, a work by Immanuel Kant, and so forth. And then, as I said, the secondary text would be, let's say, interpretations of a book on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So it tries to relate it to other movements of the Enlightenment or what have you. So how do we find appropriate texts as sources of evidence? So obviously, if we're undertaking this line of gathering evidence, the library is a choice place to start. Given the pandemic, you probably have not had a chance to visit it in person. Hopefully, you do get a chance to do that in your undergraduate career. Well, if you haven't had a chance, if this is your first year here, so hopefully you do in person. Obviously, there's still opportunity for you to access the resources remotely, and the link is there. And so for this course, the library will be your primary source for finding, let's say, the secondary texts. Other courses as well, as I said, you're going to probably use the library, even in courses where you're going to be asked to go out and gather your own, let's say, evidence in the world, like experimental data. Often, whether it's science or social science, where there could be experimental data that you are generating as part of the project and that you're going to write up. Still there, often it's expected that you'll do a literature review. So you're going to do a literature review of previous works on this question. Where are the gaps in knowledge? Where are things that you want to build on? Those types of things. So the library will still be useful there. So I'm just noticing here that quick question: will this class be only going over the assignment and tips? Yes. So this class is around the assignment and tips on writing the essay. So so I want to show you then, based on that, what would be a good point of departure. So if we can, we'll switch our sharing here to, I'll share the screen, my website here. So this is the library's main page here. So I think the one way, this is, again, this will be useful for this class, many humanities classes, but a good way to start in this search for secondary sources is to get a database of journals that are rich in arts and humanities scholarship. So I'm going here, I went to the databases link here. I'm going to go to JSTOR. So JSTOR is here. So this is it asked me to sign in. So I'm going to get access to these. A lot of them are normally behind a paywall. You have to pay them. So that through the library, we're getting access to them. So that is a privilege to take advantage of that. You have access to millions and millions of dollars, literally, published works there that are not all open access. It's something I'm trying to fight for in my other life, is to trying to liberate a lot of these publications, so that people who are not going to university have access to this knowledge that was funded by governments. Anyway, I won't get onto that hobby horse, but so all that to say, do take advantage of your time at university where you do have access to this knowledge that is behind paywalls. So I would go to, let's say, the advanced search function, and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to do an essay on Milton, and I'm doing an essay on Milton and Satan and heroism. Okay, so let's try to figure out if I can find, because there are hundreds of thousands of articles there, so we're gonna have to narrow the field down quite a bit. So a good way to really narrow it down is make sure that Milton's in the title, make sure Satan's in the title, let's say, and then maybe hero, and then that it will indicate that it could be heroic or heroism. And we can leave that open for all fields. Let's try, and then we'll try that. That should give us a good set there. So yeah, 28. So I had tried this earlier, and it gave us probably this set of 28 sources. And you can download that PDF, accept the terms and conditions, and you have access, as I said, to this article that would have otherwise cost you $35. Okay, so and then we can imagine another source, another search where maybe our key terms are, maybe you're interested in the relationship with less Satan in particular, but Virgil, so the invocation issue. Are there articles that are of interest, let's say, that are looking at both Virgil and Milton? So if you get them both in the title, you're going to be pretty sure that that's going to be the main focus of that article. And we get, okay, so yeah, that's a fairly manageable search. So if you get a search that's in that range, that's pretty good. Sometimes you get searches, you haven't narrowed it enough. Like I've done searches where get 60,000 articles coming back. We're gonna have to chisel that down, obviously, to something manageable. And here you're not reading all of those, but try to find at least 3 for the purposes of your essay that you're going to be able to engage with and use cogently in your essay. Okay, so we'll go back to the other documents. So that's the research part. Any questions on the research, what we've talked about so far? So research, think, write. So we talked some quick tips about the research. Have people been using the library for their other courses? They're feeling fairly comfortable with how they're going to be able to find sources there? Jerry?
Yeah, I tried another website for the library sources, but I think it's more useful than the Ottawa. It's easier to find the sources, I think, but it's similar. You can get similar results, but I think the other one is better, so I would choose another one.
Okay, but it's similar, just a different website to access the articles. Okay, so no questions on the research part. So now the critical thinking. So we have to be able to critically assess the various forms of evidence and determine their validity and significance for the question under investigation. So why is critical thinking important? Okay, so, well, first of all, as I said, it's probably the number one broad set of skills that employers in surveys feel is a gap of students coming out of university right now. They feel they need to have, maybe I've got a great computer engineer. He's really working on building some IT architecture for me, but there's a question of critical thinking there, or what have you, whatever field that person's in. So they keep coming back to this critical thinking. So what does it mean? So I've jotted down one way of trying to think about what's involved there. But it also, there's the employment angle, but there's also us as citizens. Okay, so there's the question around fake news and alternative facts and those types of things, and we have obviously wildly opposing views on any social media platform or website of what happened under Trump, and what's happening with COVID and anti-vaxxers and take your vaccine and those types of things. So being able to, let's say, critically assess the validity, critically assess one claim versus the other, that is kind of the crux of what critical thinking is. So in a way you could say, the failure of the current kind of public discourse is a failure of critical thinking, a failure of the ability of the public to try to come to a rational dialogue around what claims make sense and what don't, and well, maybe I can disagree with you on this, but let's try to think about that evidence. There's no room for that. Okay, so we as citizens need to bring critical thinking for a democracy to flourish, it seems to me. So all that to say, on a much smaller scale, you're also going to need critical thinking for this essay. It will also be useful for this essay. So you're going to have you're going to have information from the poem. You're going to have information from articles you've found in your research around the topic that you're exploring. And you're going to have to try to take that information and figure out where maybe some evidence shines light on other pieces of evidence and reinforces it, or maybe it trumps it and says, well, gee, this is evidence that maybe this person didn't consider, and now that person's viewpoint is I would say maybe null and void. So I would say there's some basic things to keep in mind if you're in this basket of skill sets, or a couple of elements of this set of skill sets. First is being able to question. Okay, so questioning assumptions. So first of all, there's the question, understanding the question, the research question. What's the realm of inquiry that I'm looking into? And then questioning the assumptions, your own assumptions, the assumptions of others at the start. Okay, so the question guides the initial research. So what, let's say, is Satan the hero? So that guides the opening. But also, if we're open-ended in questioning our assumptions, it can lead to other questions. So maybe we pose questions about our understanding of the concept. So I have some examples there. If we ask, is Satan a hero? We might ask, what are the traditional conceptions of heroism? Are these conceptions static, or did they evolve over time? And if they evolve, how are these evolving concepts taking shape in the early modern period? How does Milton relate to that period? So let's say we've already, through that questioning, put into sharper relief what that initial question around Satan as hero could look like, because we've problematized that and we've torn it apart a bit, and we've said, oh, okay, well, I guess I never did define what hero is. Do I mean it this way? Did I take this into account? And now you've got another set of pathways. You could, obviously, the more you do that, we could go off on research trails forever, right? So that's the kind of the problem that people get into in their PhD dissertations. They get into researchitis and they go down rabbit holes forever. But very important, especially at the initial stage, that we're questioning assumptions. And then if we go back again, as I said, to the why that's useful for, let's say, an industry, what, you know, if someone's just saying, well, okay, I'm going to do this because that's the way so-and-so told me to do it. That's the way we've always done it. If we don't question these things, we're never going to innovate. We're not going to have the kind of foresight to see challenges before they arrive and adapt for them. We're not going to be able to find ways that are more efficient, that are going to be on the cutting edge or the bleeding edge, as gurus say. So that kind of questioning of assumptions can be useful in industry or any organization, government, not for profit. So how is it useful in the, let's say, the citizenship debate I was talking about? So if I'm, you know, at the scrolling through and I get this thread that I don't know but it's from this kind of alt-right group that is saying that, you know, aliens invented COVID or something like that in order to make me be their slave, I don't know, whatever. Then if I could just say, well, that's okay, that's great, it's written, it must be true, and so Gary 853 agrees with it, so that must be true. And then without questioning assumptions, so questioning, okay, where does it come from, those types of things, then we can have ourselves locked into a particular paradigm without ever busting out of it. We can be locked in our own kind of echo chamber of reinforcing views without ever questioning any of the views, right? Okay, so, but the same on the other side, right? Like the same on every side of the thing, always they have to question their assumptions. Is mass vaccination, if taken to its logical extreme, where we force everyone to get vaccinated, even those who might have a religious reason not to, whatever, is that too far? You'd have to question the logic of a pure vaccination program versus an anti-vaxxer program as well. So all that to say, questioning assumptions, key for democracy, key for your job, and on a smaller scale will be very useful for this essay. Understanding, so starting from a question, you've started to bring in evidence through research. So you're using research skills that we already talked about to bring in the evidence. Now, armed with that question, with that evidence, you're going to lead to a deeper understanding by making connections, okay? So making connections between this concept and that concept. Milton said this here, that poet said that here. There's a connection there. Bringing things, seeing how they could be linked, whether it's causally, whether it's because they have a concept in common, whether it's because they're part of a shared social or cultural movement, and that they could be seen as two expressions of that. That's part of you taking what could be otherwise atomic and chaotic bits of information and beginning to make it into a meaningful whole for yourself, okay? Now, another aspect, though, is it's kind of almost the opposite, is analysis. So analysis is kind of taking apart and saying, okay, well, there's a connection there, but let's take that connection apart and see if it's a causal connection. Is this really the same thing as that? Those types of questions, and people use different things. I have to say, I don't necessarily use these visual tools all the time if I'm trying to think about writing a paper or something like that. But some people use these things like mind maps for doing this type of analysis, to say, okay, well, Milton was a Puritan, and okay, so I draw that and I try to draw a visual what that means. So Puritanism, okay, so that's kind of a religious kind of ultra reform movement. Okay, what does that mean over here? And then over here on the opposite, we've got a different kind of tendency, and what does that mean? What's that connected to? So you can start to visualize some of the connections you're making and analyzing, okay? Same with cause and effect diagrams. So if we try to analyze what we're putting together as a causal chain. So this aspect of literature leads to this. This leads to this notion of heroism. This leads to that, okay? So as I said, I don't use them all the time. I find just, I usually go for an outline of some sort, but it's still a way of visualizing the connections of the themes that you're exploring. And then synthesis, so at this this point, or this kind of set of skills that you need for critical thinking, the evidence is assembled and analyzed, and you're trying to bring it back to a meaningful whole about the original domain. So I've taken all these arguments and these particular lines from Milton's Paradise Lost and so-and-so's interpretation of that line, and I've analyzed them, and I said, well, no, that interpretation's wrong because there's this line over there too, and now I've got to bring that back to a meaningful whole, okay? So the synthesis is that aspect of it, okay? Any questions on critical thinking? It's a bit more abstract than the research skills, obviously, because the research skills, at least what we talked about, was rather limited and kind of practical example of how to undertake it. But do people talk about, kind of a naive question, is critical thinking something people talk about in other courses that they've taken in undergrad?
I think, yeah, we talk about critical thinking in all our courses. We need to.
Okay, so it's coming up in a lot of your classes, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Any insights for people who've I hope I didn't bore you with repetition, or hopefully it's a new light on it. Any insights for people who've thought about this in other classes in different ways?
I'd say it comes up a lot in other social science courses.
Okay. And that is, who is that? Simona? Or no?
Isabel.
Isabel, thank you. So yeah, and as Jerry said, probably comes up or is expected in a lot of the courses. Yeah. And do people try to walk you through what it entails, and give you tips for this? Just out of my own curiosity, I think it's, so as I said, it seems to be what employers are making it very clear that there's a gap there and we need to fill it. So I'm just curious whether or not the universities are living up to that.
For me, in my politics and globalization class, almost all of our assessments or assignments are based on critical thinking. So we don't have anything like multiple choice or just like quick one-word answers. It's all based on essay writing and kind of giving our own interpretation on a very vague prompt or question, and then using evidence and applying our own like personal opinion, but also making insightful analysis related to the course material. So it's really just centered around teaching us how to make real world connections, I guess.
Perfect. Thank you. Good example. Yeah. So yeah, definitely happening in a lot of courses. So try to think about those distinctions that we were talking about today in terms of, I guess, different aspects of what's going to be required there if you're going to, questioning, understanding, analysis, synthesis, etc. Okay. So now if we go to the writing part, so I said there, we need to research, we need to think, we need to write, and probably all at once to some extent. The writing part, you can leave most of that to the end, but you're going to be doing some writing. You're writing down ideas and those types of things, but you're going to need research skills and critical thinking skills and writing skills. So the writing skills I'll go over quickly here. So as I note on this page, the essays for this class are and your final will be graded in accordance with these 5 criteria. So the thesis, the argumentation, the logic / organization, the style and the mechanics, And I'm going to this other document here. So these documents just are on the essay writing, sorry, the essay tips site. Okay, so the documents I'm referring to right now, both the research, think, write, and this is the elements of an excellent academic essay document. Both of those are on the essay writing tips site. Okay. So the first part, so I said there's 5 parts. The first part is thesis. So what is a thesis? So first of all, let's back up and say, in generally speaking, in most of these academic forms of writing, you're trying to persuade the audience of your interpretation of evidence, okay? You're trying to convince them, and as I indicate here, it's something we do all the time, right? We try to convince people. So there's this persuasion as a way of discoursing is something we do all the time, you know, as opposed to, let's say, orders. You know, there's imperatives, you know, like, which I often use with my kids. You know, persuasion doesn't work with them. I've tried, you know, it's like, stop. You know, that's the only thing that seems to work. But hopefully soon I'll be able to use reason and persuasion. There's, as I said, there's different forms of communication, but persuasion is one we're use all the time in our day-to-day lives. And an academic argument follows this pattern where you're going to have this kind of introduction of your topic, a thesis statement, generally, you know, fairly concise, that is the summary of the point you're trying to prove, and what the rest of the paper will show. In a lot of science, it's reversed, you know, so your kind of thesis is in a way the conclusion that's at the end, depending on the format of the science, but the logic is the same. Okay, so I've got a topic, I've got evidence that I've marshaled and I'm analyzing, and then there's let's say a punchline at the end which is your kind of interpretation of that evidence that you're trying to persuade the audience of. So in the humanities, the format generally accepted, where you'll probably get the least grief, you know, is to have it where the thesis is at the top. Okay, so generally, you know, the introduction of the topic in some way, and then what you're going to prove. And what is a thesis statement? It tells the reader how you're going to interpret the significance of the subject matter, lays out it. Ideally, it also kind of lays out the design in terms of the types of arguments you're going to look at. Like, it's going to say, you know, I'm going to show that Satan is the hero by looking at his martial achievements, how other characters interact with him, and whatever, you know, and a third thing or a fourth thing. So you've also, in laying out what are going to be your domains of evidence, your types of argument that you're going to use, you've also given the reader a heads up of where that the paper is going. Okay. The other thing it's key here is the thesis makes a claim that others can dispute. So it's not obvious. So the thesis has to be specific, and I want to talk about that. It's got to be kind of something that others can dispute. It's not obvious, and it's got to be argumentative. Let's say it's got to be as opposed to or analytical. Sorry, as opposed to evaluative, and I'll talk about that in a second. So argumentative, this is the point I made there about something, you know, that it's like it's a point you're trying to prove. It's not just a general discussion. So you're saying that, and someone could reasonably try to argue the other side. So an example of a sentence that's not, or that's just a general topic you'd want to explore is the following essay will discuss sin. So you could say, well, there's sin as this, and here's one conception of sin, and here's one conception of sin, but there's no kind of zeroing in on a particular statement that you're going to try to marshal evidence to prove, okay? And the next statement is an example of the opposite, where that is a thesis. The following essay will demonstrate that in Book 9 of Paradise Lost, Milton presents sin as a type of turning away from God. Okay, so because people could conceivably conceive of a different way of interpreting what sin is in Paradise Lost, or how sin should be understood. Okay, and you're gonna say, well, no, this is my view, and I'm gonna show it by looking at Book 9. I'm gonna look at the way Eve and Adam do this, and I'm gonna look at this. And then when you do look at that, you get evidence. And remember, our evidence are primary texts and secondary texts. So it's controversial. It's possible for a reasonable person to disagree with it. It's analytical. So I mentioned that before. So it's not evaluative. So an evaluative one is kind of like a book review, you know. So a book review of a novel is, oh, this was a great novel, I really liked it. Okay. So an analytical is you're trying to analyze the work, not evaluate it. So okay. So an example of an evaluative statement, William Faulkner's "As I Lay Dying" is a masterful expression of human angst. I like that one. An example of an analytical thesis is William Faulkner's "As I Lay Dying" uses innovative narrative techniques in order to disorient the reader, not providing a stable narrative identity with whom the reader can identify. This narrative disorientation is a means Faulkner uses for representing modern angst. Has anyone ever read "As I Lay Dying" by Faulkner? I could have put it on this course. It's a very good novel. No hands? No hands? Read it.
No.
Read it. Read it after the course this summer. It's a good one.
Okay.
Okay. So it's about the text. It's not about the world. So the thesis is, saying if you're looking at Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, your analysis is going to shed light on the text. It's not going to presume to be an analysis of the social world outside. And specific, I cannot emphasize this enough, okay? So it defines a narrowly defined topic. You got 4 pages, right? So people write whole books on one element of Paradise Lost, a small element, like on the notion of Satan or Satan and sin in Paradise Lost, and they write huge books. So you're going to have to, for it to be at all meaningful, you're going to have to really get specific. So examples that are too broad, and I literally have had these in other courses. Shakespeare's sonnets are all about love, so first of all, the scope, so the thesis itself, the topic that's being examined is too broad. So love is not defined. So love is here, okay? So you'd have to get to a particular aspect of love. And the scope is not defined. So the scope of your inquiry is all of the sonnets. So if you've got 4 pages, you should probably concentrate on one sonnet, okay? And then the other example, Plato's allegory of the cave deals with education. So there, a couple of problems with that. It's too broad and it's obvious. At the beginning of the allegory, Plato says that this is an allegory of education. So I'll go through a few other examples here. And these are examples of, so when you're starting your essay, as I said, you kind of start with a way to bring the reader into the topic that you're going to discuss, right? But every sentence is precious. So make sure that sentence is leading you to the thesis, okay? Otherwise it's superfluous. And if it's broad and if it's something that I can read in Wikipedia, that's a waste of a sentence, okay? So unless it's getting you right to the thesis, don't put it in there. And people will ask sometimes, so it just reminded me, people will ask, what should I assume the audience? What should I assume about the audience? Because, sometimes for that, what I'm saying is superfluous might not be superfluous if you're a 6-year-old child, right? Like Plato was a guy who lived in Greece a long time ago, So assume that this is an educated, university educated audience. So you don't have to say Plato wrote a lot of good books or those types of things. Okay. Plato's, so some examples of superfluous material there, I won't go through them. Plato was a great philosopher who studied with Socrates. So a good thesis statement, a good one in terms of laying out the structure of the essay and narrowly defining what will be discussed. So this is an example from an essay I had before. So it also has some flaws, like the thesis could be improved in terms of the clarity of the concepts. So the truth, this is about Plato, the truth, like the sun, after one has been staying in the darkness, hurts. Thus, those who see the truth and stay with it are rare. And when they try to bring it to the masses, they will be fought and sometimes persecuted for disrupting the order, even though the order is based on falsehood. The implications in the ethical and political teachings of the allegory are that we must recognize our false reality, choose to view the truth, and continue to do so regardless of exterior pressures. So see the end there. It was good that it got to a point where the thesis was fairly clear at the second last statement there, that these are the implications for the teachings of the allegory, is that we have to recognize false reality, probably could be more narrow, clearly defined what those concepts mean. And we're going to see that that means that we have to choose to view the truth, continue to do so regardless of exterior pressures, etc. And a not so good thesis statement, the allegory of the cave shows us the importance of education and how this education makes the world better. So again, broad, obvious, needs to be more narrowly defined, okay? So really specific, remember that if you take nothing else away from the thesis discussion, specific, okay? Now, so I said there's five elements, the essays that I look at in the essay. Thesis, is it clear what you're going to tell me? And is it specific? And is it analytical? All those things we just talked about. And then there's argumentation, logic / organization, style, mechanics. Okay, so that's a big one because it sets up argument and logic for failure if this is no good. Okay, you can't have a good set of arguments and logical flow if this thesis is no good. Arguments are logically constructed claims you are making to support your thesis. So each is an idea, okay? So, a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs is fleshing out that idea. And ideally, both the idea discussed in the paragraph and its connection to the thesis are evident. And ideally, it's evident from the first sentence of the paragraph, okay? So there's not a long wandering train of discussion, and then I'm trying to go, or the reader's trying to go, okay, well, how is this connected to, you're talking about Milton and heroism, why are you talking about Puritanism over here? As you're talking about Puritanism, and then you say, oh, and for that reason, Milton, okay, so make sure, every paragraph's kind of like your essay where you have to show what's the kind of encapsulating idea of that paragraph, okay, right at the front. They're not summaries, okay? Here's another trap that undergrad literature students get into, and history students and philosophy students. So when they're looking at analyzing a text, is to instead of presenting arguments that are backed with evidence, they present a summary of the text in question, okay? So this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, okay? So there was an example of, here's an example of a summary that doesn't advance an argument. So it's in a summary of what's happening in the cave. So we're still talking about arguments now. Now evidence is what supports the arguments. So I think about the relationship between thesis, argument, and evidence. I like to think of it like a defense attorney, right? So I think I wrote that down there. So if a defense attorney's thesis is my client is innocent, Okay, so it's a pretty clear thesis, right? It's specific, it's sharp, it can be argued. In fact, the person across the aisle is arguing the exact opposite case with very similar evidence and other evidence. So the defense attorney's got to make some arguments. So let's say the argument is, I think I've got an example here, right? So the argument one, so if the defense attorney is trying to say my client's innocent because she did not commit that murder. That's my thesis. She did not commit that murder. She is innocent. Argument one, she could not have committed the murder because she's out of town that day. Argument two, she didn't know that person or what have you. Argument three, she had no motive, whatever. So argument one, she was out of town that day. I need evidence to support it, right? So evidence in this case might be eyewitness accounts, you know, GPS data from the cell phone, credit card transactions, what have you. So the same with your thesis, arguments, evidence. So you've got a thesis, Satan is not the hero. Okay, good. That's a good thesis. Argument. Okay, Milton only wants us to think Satan is the hero and traps, whatever, you know, it's kind of a very, not a well articulated argument. Evidence. I quote from the poem. I quote from secondary sources who are also analyzing that aspect. But I don't, while we're talking about that, but I don't just let that evidence sit there, unpack. I have to unpack it, okay? I have to show how it supports the argument. So I don't just, if I'm the defense attorney, I don't just throw a MasterCard receipt down there and go, you know, I just, here you go. And then, you know, the jury's going, well, so the guy bought a VCR. What does that mean? So no, look at the timestamp, right? Timestamp, December 24th. So-and-so was in timestamp Chicago. Okay, they couldn't have done it. That's my point. Forget about the VCR. Okay, so you've got to go and highlight the point you're making about how that evidence supports the argument. Okay, same with a quote. You get this quote from the book. I've already read the quote. How does that, I didn't agree with your argument before, and I'd already read that. How does that support your argument? Okay. So you've got to unpack what out of that quote, what out of that secondary source is supporting that argument. Okay, so we talked about thesis, argumentation, logical organization, and connection. So also critically important, okay? So we need logical connections within the paragraphs. So the sentence leads to sentence leads to sentence, and among the paragraphs, okay? So I'll just use this, take this point to underline these conjunctive adverbs and coordinating conjunctions are very useful for showing in your prose the logical operation you're making between the two statements, okay? So do get acquainted with those types of, and there's many others, and there's many other tricks, but the ability to use those can help you draw the dotted line for the reader in terms of where your logic is heading, okay? So logical connections, very important within the paragraph, from paragraph to other paragraph. So how is that paragraph related to the thesis? Okay, so how is that bit of evidence related to the idea you're trying to discuss in that paragraph? Okay, and now how is that building on this sentence? Are you going off onto another one? Should this have been a new paragraph? How is that related? Okay. So sound, style, and mechanics. Here, I don't have as much concrete advice, okay? So when it comes to style, I'm more forgiving than for the others, okay? Because it's, you know, it's something that, you know, we're all young, we're not necessarily great authors. Many of you, English is a second language, you know, so this is tough at the best of times. So I'm more forgiving on the style part. and I don't have concrete advice for you. There are no concrete pieces of advice. What I mean by style, I guess, is the quality of the writing, let's say the variety of structure of the phrases, the diction, those types of things. So that will give the writing a readability, so to speak. Okay. Clarity of expression. So if it's so poorly written, both between the style or between the mechanics, like the grammar's bad, the spelling's so bad, then if it's so unreadable, I have to take marks away there. But otherwise, I'm fairly lenient. If you're looking at, let me back up. As I said, there's not really concrete advice that can be given as opposed other than to read good writers and to write. It's practice. It's seeing it and practicing. There's really nothing else to say. Like there's no tricks. Like the thesis, I can give you a trick, or logical connections. Try to use these trick words, But for this, it's too complex and ever evolving. Mechanics. There's obviously the style guide can help you. There's there's obviously grammar correcting software out there that should be helpful. In some cases it is not, but most of the time it is. There's also the writing center help is out there. So there's the Faculty of Arts Writing Center that you can contact and book virtual time with to go over what you're working on. And for those there's the Student Academic Success Services also, so 2 avenues there. I've heard the first one, the Faculty of Arts Writing Center. I've heard it's useful for students. And I'm sure it's the same for the other. It's just that I've actually heard on the first case. So that's the lay of the land when it comes to the assignments for the end of March. Any questions? How do we feel? Comments, questions? Jerry.
Yes, Professor, you said we need to combine the primary and the secondary sources in our essay, but I don't know how to combine it.
How to combine them? Is that what you mean? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say combine them. Maybe I misspoke there. I mean, you're going to be using both to make claims, right? So your primary text, in this case, Milton's Paradise Lost, is your primary text, and we want to understand that better. That's our goal, is to understand that text better. Now, the secondary sources can help you. So people who've also interpreted Paradise Lost can help you either bolster or they can be arguments that you react against in terms of your interpretation of Milton's Paradise Lost. So if you say, I think Satan's the hero because he does this, it's not just me, so-and-so, check out, what's his name? I'm forgetting the name of a famous author who supports that view. So-and-so, as so-and-so says in their great article, blah, blah, blah. And then you can quote them that's supporting a very specific point you're making, okay? So it's not as though you're blending it or combining it with the primary text. You're using that secondary text to support a claim you're making about the primary text, okay?
Oh, okay.
Other questions, comments?
Yes, Professor. But if we I have a claim, but it's opposite to contradict to the secondary sources. Can we just my opinion is this, and then other one is like this,
Yeah, you'll just have to make sure you marshal some evidence, get evidence that shows the gap or the limits of the other view. So if you, and that's where the other opinion can help you. Like if you say, someone says Milton's Satan is the hero, and then you want to and cites X, cites the fact that Satan is is the first character we see and is presented in these heroic terms, then you say, yeah, but they're missing the boat. They're missing the fact that later on, Satan, they say that and they cite the beginning of the poem, but they're forgetting the end of the poem. Okay, so that person, you've cited other evidence to counter their claim. Okay, you can't just say, yeah, well, they said this, but I disagree. Right. I hope that helps.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions on the assignment? We've got a few weeks. There's chances to ask questions as we do our discussions of Milton, and hopefully these going over research, critical thinking, and writing. Hopefully you've got some tools in the toolbox, as they say, to be able to do that comfortably when the time comes. Get started thinking about it now. It's going to take some time, right? So as you're reading Paradise Lost, think about what would the topic I want to do? What would be the question I want to ask? Should I start looking at some secondary sources now? Get the ball rolling. When I talk about the process, I didn't go over it today, but it's on the Essay Writing Tips website. Don't leave it to the last day. I say that from experience, but I've been there. I was an undergrad and I did it too. I've been in your shoes, and I know it's difficult to avoid that, but if at all possible, try to get the ball rolling on it. Give yourself some milestones. Okay, without any further ado, I don't see any other comments or questions. I'm going to bid you a good week, and I will see you next week, where we're going to start to discuss one of the greatest works, my favorite work probably of all literary works, Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay, I'll see you next week.